All right, I am just going to dive in with some opening remarks just to kind of get us off the ground and get ready for the presentation to be run through. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ARMA's EPR webinar series. As I mentioned, this is the second session of our workshop series in partnership with Dillon Consulting. My name is Kayla Duty, and I'm a communications manager with Canadian Strategy Group, and it is my pleasure to serve as facilitator and moderator for the workshop today. And before we get going, I would just like to kick off with a land acknowledgement. ARMA works with Albertans from all areas of our province and acknowledges the Indigenous peoples who live among and travel the land in the area currently known as Alberta. The relationship that peoples of Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, Alberta's Métis and Inuit peoples have with the land is founded on a deep respect for the environment. This connection forms the foundation of our responsibility and vision of inspiring a future without waste. Today's webinar is the second of a three-part workshop series to help prepare communities for changes to their waste management system following the transition to EPR. So today is focused on your future state. So this workshop will cover a few things. It will guide you to envision your community waste system's future state scenarios, provide an overview of the EPR change management planning tool, and show you how to apply change management principles to understand what will start, stop, change, and continue under each scenario. To keep the time moving along nicely today, we will follow prior webinar settings where registrant audio functionality has been turned off unless requested by you. So that means to ask questions, we have two different ways you can do so. We invite you to use the Q&A chat, which you should see on the bottom of your screen, or use the raise your hand function as well. Dillon Consulting will be opening the floor to questions after each section in their presentation, and we'll address any questions you have then either by looking in the Q&A chat or by unmuting you as indicated by the raise your hand function. A reminder as well that these webinar sessions are being recorded and will be made available on the ARMA website afterwards. So with that all being said, I'm now going to turn it over to ARMA EPR Executive Director, Gabby Betts. Over to you, Gabby. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kayla, and thank you everyone for coming. As Kayla mentioned, this is the second of ARMA's three workshop series on community EPR transition planning. And one of the top priorities for ARMA is supporting Alberta's diverse rural and urban communities. And so we're really happy to be here today and to be presenting you with this workshop series. And on that note, we always love to hear from you. And so please do get in touch with us following the workshop and let us know if you have any feedback. We do want to make sure that communities are very well supported. So if you have feedback and or other ideas for support that communities can use, please do get in touch. At the end of this workshop, we will provide an email address so you can get in touch directly with our EPR team at ARMA. And if you ever go to our website as well, you will always find our email address there in a dedicated EPR section where we have lots of resources for communities that will be helpful to you as well. So in terms of the workshops that we have for you today, the focus of the community workshop will really be building on the first workshop that we had a short time ago. So thank you so much to those of you who were able to join the first workshop, as well as to those of you who were able to access the workshop afterwards on our website. We've made sure to post all of the recordings for not only this workshop series, but also for previous webinars, because we want to make sure that people who miss them can go back, and also that they are available if you want to look back and watch a certain section again. So please feel free to do that. This second workshop aims to assist communities in using the EPR planning tool to consider future state scenarios for its waste management system after transition of responsibilities to the PRO for EPR for PPP as well as HSP. And just as a reminder for the group, when we're referring to PPP, we're talking about single-use products, packaging, and printed paper. And when we're talking about HSP, we're talking about hazardous and special products. So as we move on, in terms of the goals of this particular session, the objectives and goals for today's workshop are really to assist you, communities, in envisioning community waste system future state scenarios, applying change management principles to understand what will stop, start, change, and continue after the EPR transition, as Kayla also alluded to, and use the EPR transition planning tool to assess future state waste management system scenarios, including the risks, benefits, and costs, as well as identifying transition activities. At the end of this workshop, communities are highly encouraged to complete the change management tool that has been provided to envision the future state scenarios for your community waste management system. And again, as you're doing this, if you have any questions or if we can provide any support here at ARMA on the EPR team, please do reach out at any time. We're always happy to help, and we love to hear from communities. So before I pass the presentation over to our presenters, as we did last time, we have some guest presenters here to support communities, and they're really using their recent experience supporting several municipalities in their planning and preparation for EPR transition in other Canadian provinces, as well as their knowledge of EPR programs and municipal integrated solid waste management systems. So we have a wealth of expertise here, and we're really happy to have them. And the primary presenters today will be Beth, Kathy, and also Kathy, and they will be supported by Sydney Baker and Charlotte Banks. And so with that, I will pass it over to the Dillon Consulting team, who will take us through the workshop for today. Thanks again for coming, everyone.
Hi. So, as has been said, previously in our last workshop, we introduced the transition tool and the framework and the approach that we take. And we talked a lot about the current state, which Beth presented on. And so since that workshop, hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the EPR tool and to start customizing the template with the current state for your community to describe your current waste management system. Today, we're going to pick up on there. And first, I'll describe a sample community, and then Beth will walk through using the tool. And we'll apply the sample community to the tool, and we'll talk about the curbside collection and drop-off depots and EPR materials and all of the changes that take place through the tool. And we'll show you the completed tool in an Excel spreadsheet for this sample community to really give you an example of the differences in the different scenarios that you can put forward for your community. So we have created a fictitious community. We're calling it the Corporation of the City of Frostview. And we did this so that we can have a concrete example to really walk through the ins and outs of using the tool. This fictitious community is located in southeast Alberta and has an area of about 110 square kilometers, a population of 60,000 people, and about 25,000 households. These are mostly single family with some multi-residential buildings. And we created this really based on what a community might look like. So we're hoping to reflect some of the communities here in this presentation today, some of the attendees, and get down into the details for you. For this sample community, we're saying that it has weekly residential collection in carts. So that's for garbage, yard waste, and recycling. They provide commercial waste collection in carts for recycling and garbage. They have 3 recycling depots. They have a landfill and a drop-off depot, which provides household hazardous waste services. We also thought that this example that we provide would be a rate-based collection system as the financial model, in-house garbage and yard waste collection, and contracted recycling collection. Now, we also say that Frostview has created a solid waste master plan just last year in 2023, and that pretty soon they'll be introducing an organics collection program. This information will help us walk through the tool, and I'll hand it over to Beth Goodger to provide that.
Beth, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm going to unmute myself and start sharing my screen of the completed tool for the template for FrostView. So let me share that now. So here you see the completed column A for our FrostView community. And I've highlighted the column A, and I'll just walk you through some of the highlights based on what you heard Kathy describe about our current state. So firstly, we have the customers. We've got the curbside residential, the multi-residential, and the 3 recycling depots, and all 3 of those areas are eligible for transition. We've got a landfill depot as well. We're saying that for FrostView, they do separate activities for public space recycling, and there's a program that's done downtown, and also a program that the Parks Department offers. The IC&I customers that FrostView serves, we've got some curbside customers that are collected as part of the curbside residential program, and also they're permitted to drop off materials at both the landfill depot and the recycling depots. And all the city facilities have recycling and garbage collection as well. We left in the row for the other customers in case we think of others as we go along, but this is an example of what we were talking about. If you don't need a row in the template, just gray it out. So those are FrostView's customers that are receiving waste management services. Having a look at the staffing, there are 2 separate areas within the waste management department. There's an administrative group, and there's also an operations group. Within the municipality, there's also a corporate group that provides customer service for our waste management business unit. And we know that the Parks Department is involved. And also corporate facilities looks after the recycling programs for their buildings. We've left a grayed out area in case we think of others as we go through the planning process. And those are the staff involved in providing waste management services. There are a couple of contracts in place for FrostView. There's a collection contract for recycling, and there's also their 3 recycling depots are operated by a contract. We decided not to list the other contracts that are in place right now, but we might do that later. So those are all of the people that are involved in providing the waste management services. Now we're looking at the business processes. So the collection system for FrostView includes the recycling. They don't have any organics yet. They've got the leaf and yard waste, curbside collection, and front-end bin collection for the multi-residential facilities. They've got a bulky waste collection system, and they don't collect anything else. So this is an example where I probably should have grayed that out when preparing the template for this community. They also have a system in place for container distribution. Because all of the collection is done in carts, there's a system there for residents to get containers if something is broken, and also if when new development comes online. So that's another process associated with the collection system. In terms of direct delivery operations, they've got the 3 depots, and they've got the landfill. They also have scales at the landfill, and they don't have any at the depots. The processing operations, their collection contract includes delivery to a processor. So they don't have a materials recycling facility, and they don't have a separate contract for that. They have a group that provides customer service that deals with calls and also does curbside visits. They do a lot of promotion and education. They've got their full range of services, website, print materials. They've got an app. They have a waste management bylaw and a group that does reactive enforcement, that if there's a complaint, they go and follow up, so there isn't any proactive activities there. They've got a system in place for new development. So there's development standards, and the waste group reviews new development, and they get information from their building department on when new development comes on board. They have a way to manage their program performance. They track waste diversion rates and also track their tonnages. And they have a few audits in place that are probably going to be useful in figuring out what's happening in their system later. We know they've got their updated master plan for solid waste, and they have a corporate greenhouse gas reduction plan and a climate change plan. And they have their group that does all the general admin, program supports, and budgeting. In terms of the facilities and equipment, they've got their curbside collection container system. So they've got the 25,000 times the various streams that they have in place, carts in service, and as well as a number of bins for their multi-res system, and some bins also at the recycling depots. They've got some fleet that they use at the landfill depots to move bins around. And they also have their receiving facilities, the 3 depots that are owned by the city, and their landfill site and associated operations. So that gives you an idea of how to use column A for the template, and this is a core piece of moving forward in using the template, and you'll be copying this for the scenarios as you go along. You'll notice that I've been collapsing rows and expanding rows, so this helps you to view the screens a little bit better as you're completing the template and working with it. We also put together a template for the a depot community to give you an illustration of what that might look like. So this is a community that has no curbside collection. So in terms of these curbside residential and the multi-residential collection that you saw for Frostview, our depot community is grayed out, and they won't be needing those rows. They could be deleted later, just an illustration to show you how that might work. So the customers are a lot simpler in that the customers are coming to either the recycling depot or the landfill depot, and also the IC&I customers that are coming to those facilities. They've got just one, they've got a group that's integrated for all of the waste management activities. They've got help from the corporate group that does customer service. They have a contract for the depot operations only and no other contracts. And when we start looking at their business processes, I'll just collapse those rows. It's a lot simpler in that we're just talking about the depot and the landfill and the scale operations. They still are going to have the customer service, promotion and education. They have a bylaw. New development is, there's no formal processes in place for that. It's a very small community. They do track their program performance, and they would have a master plan and a way to administer their programs. In terms of the facilities and equipment, it's a little bit simpler as well. No carts or bins involved here. They've got their fleet for the depot operations, and they've got the 3 depots and the landfill. So just an illustration of how that template works, and this is your key starting point for using the template and developing the scenarios. So I'll stop sharing now, and if you have any questions or if you have any feedback about whether you've started that process for your community since our last workshop.
Great. Yeah. So we have a Q&A period now. Before we continue, we want to make sure we open up the floor to anyone who wants to ask questions. Hopefully some of you had the chance to review in between the two workshops some of that material. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so again through the Q&A function you'll see on Zoom in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. Also, you can ask a verbal question by raising your hand, and we'll unmute you for your question. So I guess if we don't have any questions, we were hoping to find out if anyone had any challenges accessing any of the material, using the tool at all. If there were any sources of data that we didn't mention that you found useful.
I think I do see a question. Someone has their hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to talk now. Okay, I think that you should be able to unmute yourself now and verbalize your question.
Hi, it's Len with the Village Giants. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I typed my question as well, but I had difficulty finding the tool. Maybe only one, but I couldn't locate the tool, the Excel spreadsheet. Can you help me with that, or can you send me something on a sidebar that shows me how to get hold of that tool?
Yes, we'll be able to do that, and the template is on the ARMA website, and we'll send it'll be sent to your email as well, so that you have that as a resource. And we'll also be providing the sample community template after today's workshop as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Beth. Do we have any other questions? I'll wait a few more moments. Not see any more hands raised at the moment, and we've addressed both of them that we've received on the chat function. Feel free as well throughout to submit your questions on the Q&A function, and then once we stop in the next questions time, we can also address those later on.
All right, so we'll start talking now about the future state scenarios, and really getting into using this tool to develop potential scenarios for your community. Next slide, please. And as we talked about last time, the core options are to continue to provide those services and not register. And from our last workshop, most of the participants, virtually all of them, had registered in phase 1 or 2. So we're not going to be talking about that as an option, and we didn't include that in the sample community scenario. So the next option is transition the responsibility to the pros and become a service provider to the pros. And the third area option is that you fully transfer those services to the pros and don't act as a service provider. And we'll be working through this through the sample community as well. And it may be hard to decide at this point, next slide please, whether what you want to do. And really the using the EPR transition tool helps you to assess some of these scenarios and the potential effects that it might have on your community. And really important to note that the pros haven't made offers to any communities yet, and there's still a lot of uncertainty out there with what the negotiation process with the pros is going to look like. Up until the beginning, most recently, ARMA released the collection standards and the standards for the depots on March 1st, which are also available on the ARMA website. So that's really going to provide a lot more information for you in assessing how those systems are going to work. And it's also important to consider that things are going to change as you move forward, as more information becomes available. So starting out, you don't know what you don't know, and then move forward in getting into the analysis and understanding fully what the implications are, allows for changes in those plans and what that scenario exactly looks like. And one of the examples as well of changes that we've seen in our work with other communities in British Columbia, some of the communities decided initially to act as service providers to the pros, and then a few years into the program decided to stop being a service provider, and various reasons for that, contract changes. So this tool can be used to assist you regardless of what your future state is and or when those changes happen in your program. So next slide, please. So for our sample community, we know that the transition date is going to be April 1st, and FrostView is going to consider 3 different options. And the first scenario they're considering is that FrostView decides not to provide any EPR services. And this is for both the eligible sources and also any other sources that they serve right now. So the community is not going to provide EPR services for any customer in its waste management system. And this will mean that the IC&I customers have to seek a service provider from a private company. And all of the eligible services are going to be provided by the pros, both the collection at curbside and the depot. And I want to point out that this scenario is probably unlikely, but a really important one for your community to go through so that you can isolate all of the EPR activities and the costs. And also keeping in mind that your community is no longer responsible for these activities. So regulatory, so it's another reason to fully consider that option. And your community council may ask, well, if we don't have to do this, why would we? So you've got that analysis of the scenario where, no, it's the pros' responsibility now, and we'll be handing that over. So scenario 2 that FrostView is considering is that they're going to be an EPR service provider, and they're going to negotiate with a pro to continue providing the EPR services. And the community also wants to continue provide recycling for the IC&I locations. So this will be something to consider, that there may need to be separate collection for those IC&I services, or find some way to segregate the materials, because only the costs associated with the eligible sources would be covered by the pros. In scenario 3, the community FrostView is deciding, we think we're just going to provide some of the EPR services. So in this scenario, they're modeling what it's going to look like if the FrostView continued to provide the depots as a service to the pros. And they also they stopped the curbside collection, but they also continued to provide the collection for the IC&I locations. And in this scenario, they're going to need to think about at the depots, how are they going to track the separate waste sources from both the IC&I and the residential sources? So what we're going to do is go through some more detailed aspects of the 3 scenarios as we work through the transition tool. And we can pause here for some more questions.
Thank you, Beth. Appreciate that. Lots of information there. So we do have 2 questions submitted on the Q&A function. So will PPP and HSP be collected in the same container at curbside?
I would defer that specific question to ARMA, and also look at the collection standards and the depot standards that have recently been released to make sure you're clear on that.
Thank you. Does ARMA have anything to add on to that?
And I think ARMA has committed to following up with specific regulation and specific and any program specific standards specific questions with after the workshop.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's great. We have another question that's come in asking to review what will happen if a community decides to opt out. There are some concerns about workloads versus final products and benefits of participating moving forward.
So with it's a great question, and this is what you're going to be using the tool for, is to see what exactly is going to happen if you decide to opt out. And in this scenario, those are some of the risks. Is will residents participate, for example, in the same way if the community is no longer providing the service, or if the community no longer offers the depot service? Then you'll those are risks that you'll might be taking, but also finding ways to mitigate in your transition planning.
Thank you. And then we have a few more questions coming in. This is great. Just a clarification question about what community services means exactly in scenario 2.
So what community services means that they are going to act as in scenario 2, they're going to continue offering all of their services as they are now. And in that scenario, anything that's eligible under as a EPR service, being for PPP or HSP, would be done as a contract to the pros. So they're not making any changes in their system, but they're becoming a contractor to the pros for those eligible EPR materials.
Great. And then I think we are providing an answer to the question about a list of products to be collected as a part of EPR for PPP and HSP. So that question will be answered online. So just, oh, perfect. I think we have the answer to that there. So you can take a look at the chat function to find the answer. Do we have any verbal questions anyone wants to ask? I don't see any hands up. I think that's all the questions we have for this round. And of course, keep submitting your questions on the chat function, and we will answer those at the next question period.
Okay. I think we need to move ahead here. So using the tool itself, I'll run through the examples once I give you a little bit of an overview here. So the next slide, please. The tool itself has an overview sheet where you'll be able to list the various future state options that or scenarios that your community is going to be considering. And will be starting on row 12 of the overview sheet. And in this overview, you're going to be describing for each option very briefly, give it a name, describe the services that are going to be provided, list any assumptions that you're making for this scenario to work, and any limitations or qualifications that might be associated with that future state. And this is going to be a quick reference for you, probably something that you would use in reports to your council of these are the what we're describing as the future state scenarios that we're considering for our community and comparing and contrasting those. So next slide. So once you've, the first step is copying the template, and so now you've got your first scenario that you're considering. And the first step is going to work through documenting for all of those system components that we went through for your community, for FrostView, what's specifically going to change for that scenario, what's going to stop, what will start, what will change, and what will continue. So for the people, for your customers, you're putting your customer hat on and thinking about what are those waste management services going to look like for them after the transition for this particular scenario. For the staff, what changes are going to happen for your waste management business unit? How many FTEs, full-time equivalent staff, do you have? What's going to happen with time that they're currently spending on EPR services? And any dedicated staff will need to think about how those staff will be transitioned into other activities. Are there unionized staff that might be impacted? So thinking through the individual implications of that stop, start, change, and continue. Also thinking about changes in the other business units. For FrostView, we know that they're getting help for the customer service on their calls, and also the parks is doing the recycling collection. So thinking through those specific changes. For the contractors, we're going to be talking about how are those contracts going to be affected? Can they be terminated or extended to meet transition dates? Are there contract provisions in place that could be amended for EPR services? So for example, you're going to need to look at the list of materials that you currently collect, and is it the same thing that's going to be part of the common collection system, and could you amend your contract to change those materials or service levels? And if your community is deciding to transition fully to the pros, are there, and it's ahead of your termination date for your contract, are there some early termination costs that you might incur? For the business processes, you'll now putting your internal hat on and thinking about how you're delivering these services and the specific processes used, and how are these business processes going to be modified for the particular scenario. And the last area is the facilities and equipment that you own. How is that going to be affected through this particular scenario? So the first step of the process does take some time. I'd really encourage you to, if you're the lead in the planning role, to complete that step and then work with your teams to think through to make sure you've captured all of the details. And a really critical aspect of the whole process to fully understand those change implications in the various parts of your waste management system components. Once you've got that done, moving on to step 2 is starting to think about the risks and the mitigation. So this is really considering the threats, potential threats and weaknesses of the changes for this future state, and so what could go wrong, and then also identifying potential actions that you would need to take to mitigate the risks. And questions to think about here is in the scenario where you're going to be a contractor to the pro, are you able to meet those contract requirements? Are there risks in the requirements? Are you willing to accept those risks? So, for example, the collection standards would set out performance targets and other contractual obligations. So this will be part of the planning process to go through all of those, and gets covered generally as a transition activity, but a lot to think about there in considering that particular option. Next slide. The next area is thinking about, from the customer perspective, residents in the scenarios where it will be a pro responsibility. How are you going to handle those questions and concerns that they might have about the EPR collection system? And you'll see how that works when we start looking at the various scenarios. And in considering options, a risk mitigation is continuing to provide services for sources that aren't included in the EPR system. So downtown businesses, the public spaces, and I'll show you for the sample community how that actually becomes a risk mitigation option. And overall, in assessing risks, does your community's continued involvement add benefit to the rest of your waste management system and waste diversion objectives? So these could be deciding factors of continuing on, perhaps even if it costs slightly more. Maybe not all of your costs are covered, but there might be some benefits of continued diversion and continued ability to serve non-eligible customers. And also thinking about, if you choose to be a service provider now, is there a contractual opportunity to stop being a provider sometime later on in the process? Step 3 is thinking about the benefits of the changes and the strengths and opportunities associated with each particular scenario. And we've suggested in the EPR tool some general criteria of environmental, social, financial, and it can be customized if your community has some specific criteria that you use. So the key benefits are going to be from the environmental and financial aspects of the EPR benefits of the producers taking responsibility for those materials and the associated cost savings. But you'll see as we work through the template that there's going to be different types of benefits depending on the option or scenario that's being considered. And when you're handing over, if you decide in one of the options to hand over responsibilities to the pro, then this might free up resources to offer to provide programs that you weren't able to before. So our Frostview community will be thinking about, hey, we haven't done organics yet. How can our services be realigned? And that going through these scenarios can help provide a business case for jumping into things that you hadn't previously considered. And also the benefits of risk reduction as well. So this is noodling through those, what are the benefits for this particular scenario? Step 4 of the process, the next slide, is coming up with the specific transition activities associated with the different components of your waste management system. And these are going to be what needs to happen to go from your current system to transition to this future state scenario. And you'll find that working through the template, it helps to identify those activities. There might be broad category activities, and communications is a huge one, but that will be a customized activity for each of the customers. And it also helps to flag where there might be one-time transition costs. And an example, thinking about what do you need to do to implement the changes, it might be that there's a lot of demands on staff, and we've seen communities that we've worked with, they implemented temporary staff positions to manage the workload during the transition. If things are really complex, you still have to run your day-to-day operations. So what are those things that you need to put in place? And other transition activities are things that help to mitigate the risks, and changes in how you monitor performance. So things that, well, what am I going to do to change how I measure performance for my waste system? And so those are examples of things that you'll be going through. Step 5 of the process is looking at high level on costs. So how are your operating and capital budgets going to be affected by this particular scenario? And using the tool to identify qualitative financial impacts. And what I mean by qualitative here is there going to be increase or decrease in costs or no change? And this helps when you go through detailed financial analysis to make sure, hey, I'm expecting to see a cost savings in this particular area. Where am I seeing that in my specific budget lines? Making sure that that gets quantified and picked up. So really a tool to use as you're reviewing the budgets and developing detailed budgets. And looking at overall impacts on your waste management system. So in all cases, if you, with transition of responsibilities to pro, or unless you decide to keep doing the services, which most communities have not on this webinar have decided not to do, there's going to be some reduction. It's just a question of how much that's going to be. That if you have integrated operations, things like co-collection, your depot costs will continue whether you have a bin for an EPR material or not. So there's going to be some of those fixed costs that will continue regardless. And also what's going to happen with revenues. So if you are charging a rate for recycling services, what's going to happen there if you're receiving revenues from recyclable materials? That all has to be considered as you're developing your plan. And this qualitative review helps to get into the detailed financial analysis. Next slide, I did talk about the fixed costs for the EPR programs, and this would be those direct costs like a contract. So those are much easier to quantify than some of the indirect or costs that will continue to deliver other waste management services. The other aspect about the costing is in the capital side of things. If you have any stranded assets, so in our sample community, they don't have a recycling facility, but they do have carts. So all of those carts, that is an investment of the community that they've made, and is now something that cannot be recovered. But on the flip side, it will be something that they don't have to spend any money now in the capital budget to replace carts. And there may be other additional costs in the system. If there's a thought that there needs to be increased enforcement, for example, if there might be illegal dumping around a depot, but really projecting what those potential areas might be and where your system might be influenced. So those are the 5 steps. And what we can do now is switch into the examples for our sample community.
I believe we are pausing here again quickly just for some
Okay.
more questions.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. We have had some come in. So Beth, do you recommend that the worksheet is completed before engagement with pros?
Yes, definitely. This will really help you get ready for those discussions with the pros. And so you'll think of a lot of details and have a lot of readiness, particularly on the contracts side of things if you complete those. And really, it's been quite helpful for our communities in doing that.
Great, thank you. And there's another question about the ability to complete the tool if there hasn't been any information from pros regarding services and costs. So wondering if you can speak to that.
Yes, that is a challenge at the beginning of the process when you don't know all of the information. And what it does, though, I'll show you when we get to the sample tool, that you would list those as assumptions that you're making and limitations for a particular scenario, so that you can still go through and do some forecasting while you're waiting for that information to come back to you. And then when you do get the information from the pros, you can reassess. We have an example of one of the communities that we worked with that they initially decided not to provide any services, and then the offer came back from the pros and they decided, now that we see it and we've done all of this financial analysis, it does make sense for us to continue to provide depot operations in this specific example.
Amazing, thank you. I do see we have a hand raised. So I am going to unmute you right now and you can ask your question. Go ahead, Paul.
Not hearing anything. Hey.
No, I'm not sure if you're speaking, Paul. We're having a difficult time hearing you. Maybe you can hold on to that question, and we can try again in the next time we pause for more questions, or feel free to submit your question. Apologies about the technical difficulty there. And then we have two more questions on the Q&A function. One is just asking if the sample template is going to be made available.
Yes, it is.
Amazing.
And that's what it's there for. Feel free to copy and paste.
Amazing. And then one more question just about the term enforcement, which you've been using quite a bit. Can you expand a little bit on what you mean by enforcement, Beth?
Sure. I'm referring to bylaw enforcement activities, and some communities have proactive programs where they go and do curbside inspections and check to see if the materials are in the right streams and so I'll call that proactive enforcement, and use that as a way to increase diversion. And they might do that type of enforcement to do targeted promotion and education, or P&E as well, versus the reactive enforcement. A community you have your waste management bylaw in place, but you only go and follow up if there's a problem. So if there's a complaint about improper set outs or things like that, then the enforcement staff would go and do that sort of activity. And we see a mix of this type of activity being provided by the waste teams themselves, or through the community bylaw enforcement group, who are enforce a community's full range of municipal or community bylaws.
Amazing. Thank you, Beth, for providing that answer to the question. I think we are wrapping up this question period. So I'll hand it back to you, Beth, to dive into the transition tool a little bit more.
Okay. All right. So we've here is the tool, completed tool for FrostView. And this is the overview sheet that I have up, that I was talking about, that you would complete first before doing the various scenarios. And so scenario 1 is the no EPR services, and the description here that the community is not going to provide services anymore for EPR system materials to any customer. The residential customers are going to receive the services from the pro, and the IC&I is responsible for getting their own service provider. This is a little bit more detail in the particular system, and you can add as much as you want when you're using the template, so that you and your team members are clear what you're talking about. So important here is putting the transition date as to when that change is going to happen. And so the current contracts that the FrostView has in place for EPR services, they're going to terminate those as of April 1st, 2025. And after that, they're going to be transitioning, monitoring to make sure that the EPR materials are going to be diverted. All the other waste management services are going to continue to be offered, and they're still going to provide all of their promotion and education, or P&E, on the programs. So that's not going to change. Here's where the assumptions and limitations come into play. And so for this option or scenario being considered, we're assuming that the diversion of residential EPR materials is going to continue at the current levels and improve after EPR is implemented. We're assuming that there might be a little bit of increase in quantities of garbage from the ineligible sources, from IC&I and city facilities, because of not all of those customers finding their own way to continue on with the recycling. They have a staff complement, a direct staff complement of 1.75 FTEs, full-time equivalents, that they're currently spending on EPR activities. And because they don't have any dedicated staff, they're not assuming any reductions in staffing, even though they're not going to provide EPR services anymore. And they're going to reallocate those that staff time to other programs for waste management. Same thing is being assumed for the other business units and the customer service that they're going to, and parks, they're going to do spend time on the other areas that they're providing services for. They're assuming for the facilities and equipment that any carts that are out there are going to remain with the customers and are stranded assets. And the extra bays and bins that they have at the depots and at the landfill, they're going to keep those, and they're going to use them for other materials to divert from landfill. At the time of preparing this scenario, the EPR service standards and procedures were assumed to be released in early April. So this is an example of a change already that when we prepared this scenario, we didn't know that. So this is a flag to go back and do another version of the scenario once the standards and more information becomes available. We're also assuming that this is a staff-developed vision of the future state scenario and that there's going to have to be a council approval to implement this particular scenario. So that's what it looks like. This becomes a reference to support the various scenarios that you're modeling within the tool. Scenario 2 that we're considering for the city of Frostview is, in this case, they're going to be an EPR service provider to the pro. And so they're going to continue as well recycling services for the ineligible sources from the IC&I. And the community in the description, they're going to enter into this contract with the pro, and they're going to continue as well all of their other waste management services and continue all their P&E on their waste management programs. And they're also going to get some funding in this scenario from the pros to promote the EPR system materials. As with the previous scenario, they're assuming that diversion is going to continue and improve with the EPR transition. They're also assuming that their community is going to be fully compensated for the costs for transition, for managing those EPR materials. They're assuming that they're going to be able to meet the pro contract requirements, and that they're not going to have to make any service level changes for materials that they're collecting from the residential customers. They're not going to have any staffing changes. The system's running as it currently is. And there's going to be minor changes to the business processes. An change will be reporting and tracking for the pro is going to be a new process, and reporting on those contractual requirements will need to be added. We're also assuming that Frostview is going to be able to identify costs for the EPR materials and services that are provided to the non-residential customers. For this scenario, the limitations and qualifications, again, the limitation was not knowing the procedures, and that there might be an impact on the list of acceptable materials. And the Frostview also noted that their current recycling contract ends November 30th, 2027 after transition. So this is a possible flag for Frostview and potential cost increases that might incur when they have to retender the contract after this one expires. And as with the previous, we're assuming that council approval of any scenario is going to be needed. The third scenario that we modeled for you for Frostview is that Frostview decided they don't want to be part of the collection system, curbside collection system from residential customers, but they still want to be a depot provider. So they're going to be a contracted service provider for the pro, for the residential depot customers, and the residential collection is going to be provided by the pro, and otherwise they're going to maintain all of their other recycling services. So as of in the description, as of the transition date, they're going to enter into that contract with the pro for the depot services. And the residential recycling collection is not going to happen anymore to be provided by the Frostview, but they will provide the rest of those services. And they're still going to provide all of the services, including recycling from the non-eligible. And they're going to recycling services continue to be provided at the depots as well, and all of the P&E continues. In terms of the assumptions and limitations, there is similar on the diversion expectations from EPR transition, the compensation for those depot costs. ability to meet the pro contract requirements. The staffing changes, there's going to be a little bit of time freed up compared to scenario 1, but as with the first scenario, they're going to reallocate that time to other areas. And you can see that with the facilities and equipment, this is a bit of a hybrid, that the carts is the same as option 1, that they're going to remain with the customers. The depots and bays, actually, I think I was doing some overzealous copying myself here, that there won't be any changes to the depot and bays, that they're going to continue to be used because they are contracting with a pro to provide those. So we'll have to change that before we send this template out to you. So those are the key reference point for the various scenarios. What the next step is to create the various templates, the various models for each scenario. So you're taking your template that we reviewed earlier, making a copy of it, and just adding it to the sheet and giving it a new name. And then starting to go through all of the processes. So the first one is an illustration of what's happening when the community decides not to provide any EPR services. So a few things to note here. In the tool that you're going to get that's not completed, there's a link to the scenario name from the overview sheet so that you're not creating new names and descriptions of things. It's also pulling in the overview description from the overview sheet. And you're also putting in the version date of the scenario. So version 1 might be the one that you're creating for your team before you review it. I know with some of the scenarios that we've done with other communities we've worked with, we're probably up to 6 or 7 by the time the transition plan is developed, so that it's being revised each time when you're getting new information. So the first step, as we talked about in the presentation, is to look at this columns B, C, D, and E of what's going to stop, start, change, and continue for the various system components. So the first couple of the residential collection for curbside and multi-residential. In both cases, the city is going to stop the recycling service. As of the transition date, it's going to become a pro responsibility. The change is that there's not going to be any more city collection. And what the city is going to continue to do is they're going to continue with the other specific programs, being garbage, leaf and yard waste collection, and they're still going to have the garbage rate that they're charging for garbage collection. The recycling depots, in this case, the drop-off materials are, they're going to stop having the bins, the drop-off areas for those EPR materials. It becomes the pro responsibility. The EPR materials aren't accepted anymore, but they are going to continue with the depots for other materials that they want to divert from landfill. And going through the process here, I'll continue on a little bit more. So the landfill depot, same as the recycling depot, of getting rid of those EPR drop-off areas and continuing on with the other materials that are being accepted. The public spaces, they're going to pull out their recycling bins from the downtown areas and the parks, and they're only going to be providing the garbage bins. So there's no more recycling in the downtown or parks, and we'll be continuing on with garbage collection. they're going to be stopping the curbside customers for IC&I for recycling. They're still going to continue providing the services for garbage for them. And the direct delivery customers of an IC&I, they won't be able to drop off anymore the EPR materials, but they can continue with garbage and the other materials that are non-EPR. They're also going to drop the recycling service at city facilities and will only be providing garbage. So you can see that these are really meant to be quick reference points for you that now you'll be using in the transition plans to describe the specific changes for the various customers. The staffing impacts, so there aren't going to be any more EPR activities required by the staff. They're not going to start doing anything. So this is an example where an area has been grayed out in the tool. The customer service team is going to start referring any EPR inquiries to the pros. And the big change is they'll be reallocating to other programs and services that are provided by the community, and they'll be maintaining those existing staffing levels. And had the same assumption for corporate facilities, so that gives you an idea of the staffing and what it's going to look like for them. The contracts, you're seeing here that they're terminating that contract, and they're stopping the EPR services as part of the depot operations contract. So for collection, there's nothing else going forward. The service is being terminated. And in the case of the depot operations, they want to continue on with other materials that they're diverting. So the change is they're going to have to negotiate a scope change in the current contract so that the diversion of those other materials can continue. And the start will be for depot is the pros will be responsible for coming up with alternative locations for the community for the drop-off depots. You go through with the business processes. So there are some overlaps between the customers and the business processes, but you're going through and now putting your operations hat to see what's happening and changing. And the recycling collection is stopping, so the system is simplified. Probably could gray out this area as well. And there isn't any other change in the other programs, so the current service levels are all being maintained. There has to be a bit of a change in how they're distributing the business process for container distribution. So the recycling part of their operation has to be modified so that it's just focusing on the garbage and leaf and yard waste carts and finding a way to transition that to process to the pros and referring those requests for recycling carts to the pros. The depots, you can see the changes here, referring the customers to the private facilities for the EPR materials, repurposing the bins, continuing on with the non-EPR activities. The landfill operations, continuing on with, they're going to stop receiving, the EPR materials, begin referring the customers. The landfill might see a bit of an increase in material going to landfill in this scenario, as we talked about. The scale operations software would need to be updated because they're going to stop tracking the EPR materials and they'll continue on with their other processes. Moving on to the customer service part of operations, they're going to start referring the customers to the pros for the EPR materials. They're going to have to revise their scripts and business processes to talk about the new service levels, and then would be continuing on their support for the other programs. All the promotion and education materials are going to need to be updated, so remove anything relating to the EPR programs and services, and in those materials start referring customers to the pros, and revise all of the materials to reflect the new service levels, and the materials for the other programs would continue as they are. The bylaw enforcement areas, the bylaw needs to be updated, and any provisions, material types for the EPR materials would need to be removed from the bylaw. There may be a need to increase monitoring for illegal dumping at the depot areas. The change is going to be revising that bylaw to reflect the service level changes, and the bylaw and enforcement would continue on for the other waste management services being offered. New development refers to specifically how you would change your business processes for the standards, any development standards and approval processes that you have in place. And the change here is that you'll be referring the developers to the pros for those recycling requirements for new development instead of the community. So the change will be updating all of those policies and business processes. The program performance, this will be a change, starting potentially waste audits pre and post transition, so that you can monitor the amount of EPR materials going into other waste streams to make sure things are working as expected. Changing those performance metrics, so diversion rates, if you're reporting on that, are no longer meaningful. And we've seen a lot of communities really changing that reporting to be on a amount of waste generated per household or per capita as a better way of monitoring those changes. The planning documents, how will those have to be updated? So removing the EPR related components and updating the master plan to reflect that change in responsibilities, and the long-term planning will continue for the other waste streams that the community is still responsible for. For administration, updating the business processes to reflect that there's no longer a requirement for the management of the EPR materials, and the work gets focused on the other waste management programs. So that gives you an example of the change process for the various business processes. In terms of the facilities and equipment, the curbside containers, it now becomes a pro responsibility, and the carts in service become a responsibility of the pro, and the city continues to provide and purchase those garbage and leaf and yard waste carts. Same goes for the multi-res containers. The city has some fleet that they're using at the landfill for moving the EPR materials around, and the change for them for the fleet part is they're reallocating that to other areas, and there's going to be no changes to the fleet, so they'll be maintaining that. The depot, the bins for the EPR materials are going to be removed, and there'll be extra bins available if they were wanting to add some new things, so they'll be able to do that, and continuing the diversion of the other materials as well. Landfill, same impacts as the depot, really, that there's going to be some additional space to divert more materials, and the drop-off areas are going to change to remove those EPR materials. So this walks you through, and the key first step takes quite a bit of time to go through this process. And working with a team, you'll start to think about other things. And I'd recommend as well that this be where you start in the process and not do the risks and mitigations right away, and save your energy for another day. It does take quite a while to go through each individual row. I'm going to pause a little bit here for a sip. So now that you've really gone through a detailed review as best you can based on what you know today of what that future state is going to look like, you start going through what things could go wrong, and how are you going to mitigate that. I'll also talk about the benefits and transition activities along together. I think it fits well all on the same screen, just to give you an idea of how this works and some of the common themes that come up in the transition planning activities too. So in this case, where the city's not providing any services and it's a full transition to the pro, the biggest risks here are that the customers are a bit confused as to who am I contacting now, and the potential for recycling in the other streams. So the biggest mitigation measure here is the promotion and education and doing the monitoring and enforcement to make sure things are happening as you expect them to. The recycling depots have similar, and an extra risk with the recycling depots is that maybe there might be initially some illegal dumping. If a resident comes and they can't drop off the material that they used to be able to, they would drop it outside of the area or along the way. So the extra, there might be some extra monitoring enforcement, but all of these mitigation measures are similar for the three potential risks for those customers. We've definitely got the environmental benefits, though, that the producers are responsible for what they are producing. There's going to be reduced costs for the users. The recycling rate is going away, and it's going to be a lot simpler with the common collection system. And overall, for the benefits for the community, you can now focus on core activities, focus on efforts potentially on other programs, and realize those cost savings associated with not having to manage those materials. The transition activities that you would be doing here is, in all cases, a communications plan to support the transition date and align with the pro communications. So there may be some discussions with the pros, but figuring out what are they saying and making sure that you have some consistent messaging. There might be some there will be some specific communications, though, targeted for each of these different customers, and figuring out how much advance, what the timing is, when you're going to need to be letting residents know about that. The difference with the depots, there's going to have to be some updated signage at the depot, and thinking about the timing to get that in place for the transition. And you're thinking at this point when you're developing the template, I think there might be some one-time costs here for the communications plan. We have a budget for promotion and education, but we might want to do some extra things. So let's put a placeholder here for potentially adding some extra budget to manage that transition process. But overall, there might be also ways to reallocate money that you have and take advantage without adding things to the budget. So those are the direct customers that the residents will see most directly on the EPR transition. The landfill depot is going to be similar to the drop-off area in terms of the risks and benefits that we saw with the depot operations. And again, we've got the updating of the signage. In the public spaces, that will be a little bit different in that now this is a service that's being stopped completely and there isn't an alternative for them. And in this case, there's a potential to get customer complaints, and definitely there would be an increase in garbage being sent to landfill. There might be some littering and similar impacts with the parks. The mitigation would be the promotion and education to talk to residents about why the changes are being made, signage on containers, and if 2 containers are being provided, then there might need to be additional garbage containers provided there. So unfortunately, we're not seeing the environmental and social benefits that we would with the EPR transition, because these materials aren't covered, but it does allow the city to focus on those core services and savings. Again, the communications plan and to support, but there might be also some one-time costs for bins and things like that, and changing out of the bins. And we do actually capture that later on in the activities when we get down to the business processes and the facilities and equipment. So the customers, the IC&I customers, they're going to have some impacts as well. So they might be a bit confused adding the recycling and other streams, and some complaints about the processes. Mitigation here is the promotion and education specifically to them about the changes, monitoring, enforcement in the other streams. But here is a mitigation measure is to consider an option when you're going to continue collection. So this is a separate scenario and an example of how another scenario may be a mitigation measure to one of the things that you run into with a particular scenario. And that's what we've modeled in these other 2 examples. As with the other previous 2, when we're not providing the service anymore, it's allowing focus on other services, but potential negative impacts on environmental, we've just left that neutral for now. As with the other, we've got the communications plan and the one-time costs. And city facilities, this is in addition to the customer complaints. It's really a downside that the city's not leading by example anymore in promoting the programs, and a definite reason why you would want to consider an option in the other scenarios to keep providing those services. So that is the people impacts of the benefits, risks, and transition activities. The staffing impacts, sorry about jumping around here. So the staffing impacts are a little bit different, that now the risks are changes to job descriptions and collective agreement implications when we start looking at the waste management business unit. So we're going to, and this would affect the other business units as well. So looking at staff transition plans to talk with staff about their changes in roles and responsibilities, update those job descriptions, having discussions with the unions. And this is a thoughtful process so that staff are comfortable with the changes that are ahead for them. The benefits corporately is there's going to be increased capacity for staff to do other things. And this then becomes the transition activity specifically to develop that transition plan go through that detailed review of roles and responsibilities and update the job descriptions. It's also going to include training on new business processes as well. So the staff have to learn the new business processes and the implications for them in their roles. So that's what it looks like for the staff. For the contractors, the risks and benefits. The risks on the collection contract is the timing and costs for early termination. So we know that the contract expires in 2027. And so that's a risk that needs to be dealt with. And also there's potential collection disruptions pre and post transition. Anytime that you have a change in contractor, when a service is winding down and a service is starting up, the collection staff may be finding other jobs, so it may be difficult to provide service at the end of the period. And for the new company coming on board to provide the services, they have the learning curve as well of those collection routes and knowing where they need to go in your community. So the mitigation measure here is developing a specific transition plan with the existing contractor and also with a pro to understand what's happening and make sure that the balls are not dropped on that handoff period. In terms of contracts, the benefits here is that there's reduced contract administration requirements and procurement for future contracts as well. The transition plan, there is going to, that has to be developed, and there's also going to be the early termination costs for that particular contract. The depot operations, we've modeled this, that there's going to be a negotiation, so there might be some additional costs for change in services, and that materials might still be received post-transition. So developing that transition plan with a pro and work with the contractor and negotiate the change in operations and the potential impacts of the renegotiation of the contract. I'll go now into the business processes. The benefits that we're seeing really are cost savings in terms of the, sorry, that was the facilities and equipment, is increasing the capacity for the other program areas. And sorry, I've got a little messed up here. So the risks are the transition issues and that transition plan with the contractor. A mitigation measure for recycling that's a bit different than you saw above would be monitoring quantities of waste in the garbage to make sure that things are happening. And this transition plan for the contract termination and start with a pro. There's changes that are needed for the container distribution system. So there might be some risks of customer confusion. So it comes back to the communications plan and the staff training. The benefits being the reduced number of service requests. And again, coming back to the communications plan for residents and specifically how that looks on this particular business process. Just running through some of these other things, we've got the risks of the customer confusion, illegal dumping, might want to add some cameras at the depots, a potential risk in dropping HSP from the landfill depot is a hazard risk from impacts on leachate, fires, worker safety. if you stopped accepting those materials. So monitoring the disposal rates and monitoring hazards to see if something needs to be changed there. And the transition activities are redesigning the drop-off areas, the staff training strategy to improve, to inform the site users, and this communications plan as well. The customer service and P&E, there's the risks are that the staff are knowledgeable about the changes, their timing to update P&E. So it comes back to communications plans as well, and the staff training in terms of the transition activities. The bylaw enforcement, getting leading up to transition, making sure there's enough time to update that bylaw, and so the mitigation is getting started and having it ready, and you'll see that come out in the transition planning part of the workshop next time we come together. And the transition activity is drafting those bylaw revisions and getting council approval. Your planning documents, scheduling that, the administration, just to touch on that a little bit, is the workload during the transition. Mitigation measure is to develop an internal transition team to help coordinate those business plan updates, and potentially asking for council approval for additional staff. And a transition activity is establishing that team, and you'll see this come out as a specific transition activities. Also need to potentially do a detailed financial analysis of the options, and we saw the need for this with the communities that we've worked with. So really want to highlight that as an important aspect of a transition activity. And also, there are going to be changes to your operating and capital budgets. The facilities and equipment, highlighting the risks and mitigation. Customers may want to return them. Discussing inventory management with the pros is an example. Removing the bins at your depots and discussing the timing on that with the pros. And transition activities is updating of budgets, updating of signage. So this is a really detailed review of how you use the tool for those steps 2, 3, and 4. And this can often be done at a single sitting, because I think you realize that there are some overlaps here as you go through the process. I know I'm running close to time on getting through some of the examples, so I'm not going to go through all the details on the costing, but this does illustrate for you how the costing step looks at high level of what's going to happen. So in terms of the residential curbside program, we'll just talk about that one. The operating costs are going to be removed. They're not going to be revenues anymore from the recycling collection rates. Overall, there's the costs for recycling are going to be removed. There's not going to be any capital costs for carts. The P&E costs are going to increase because you'll still likely keep all of those costs, even though you're not going to be promoting the EPR services anymore. There might be some additional costs for enforcement, and they'll have to assess the impact on the rates for the other services and do a bit of review there. Overall, there's a decrease in capital costs from the purchase of the containers and a net reduction from the EPR contracts, offset by the lower revenues from the user fees and the ongoing P&E and staffing costs. So when you see the template, you'll be able to review what this looks like for the various scenarios. I'll quickly jump over to the second scenario of this is the scenario where the city is going to act as a service provider to the pro, and this particular scenario is one to look at because it has the least impact of change on the customers. So the transition activities are going to be a little simpler in this one because the impacts on the individual users aren't the same, but the risks and mitigation are going to be more significant here, is negotiating the compensation for the materials with the pro, and potential changes in material types and meeting those pro requirements. So mitigation measure here mentioned in the is the importance of the financial analysis of the costs and benefits leading up to those negotiations with the pros, so that you really understand what costs need to be covered and based on what the pro is going to be offering. Seeing the benefits here, there's no service changes, and it really becomes simpler, less of a change impact for the community and for all of your customers. The transition activities focus here more on the financial analysis of the cost to provide those services and the negotiations. There's still going to be a communications plan and a transition activity, but less significant because it's really not much of a change for the users, and similarly, not much of a change for those business processes. So I'm not going to go into that part of the sheet for this particular option, and you can have a look at that when you do see that. The third scenario for our community is they're working as a depot service provider. And now in these curbside residential, this is going to be quite similar to option 1 of the no EPR services, and a little bit more of a significant, well, quite a bit more of a significant communications plan. And in terms of the depot operations, and now being a pro service provider, it will have similar aspects of that, negotiating the compensation with the pro and doing that financial analysis. So this, I think, gives a high level look at what the differences are on these basic 3 options that we'd recommend you start thinking about, and it helps to identify some of the things that you might need to know leading into the discussions with the pros, and really develop that transition activities and the detailed transition plan. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen for now. I know that there's been lots of changes, lots of questions coming in as I've been presenting here, so I want to leave a bit of time for that as well.
Thank you, Beth. That was great information. I'm sure people have their eyes wide open with the amount of information there. So if anyone does have any questions that they want to ask verbally right now, any clarification questions on anything that Beth has mentioned, feel free to raise your hand. Give you a couple of minutes to think about some of those questions. I do have a question that was on the Q&A function, which is in scenario 2, is it possible that the municipality doesn't collect their own recycling?
Yes, it is. And that's something that you'll, so scenario 2, sorry, in this particular example, we're assuming that they're continuing to provide whatever collection services that they are collecting from. So I'm thinking that you might be meaning, are you collecting from the city facilities in this case? So if you were doing it before, you would do it again. You would continue doing that. And so you'd have to make that assumption that you are going to continue. It is possible. You might just list to say, as a separate line item, as a system component, we're going to stop collecting for this particular customer, and identify that as a noted change for the scenario. So you can customize this however you envisage that future state for your community.
Amazing. Thank you, Beth. We had another question come in about if the sample is going to be shared with the registrants, and yes, it is going to be shared after the webinar. So don't worry about that. That'll be a useful tool to have in your back pocket to take a look at. Any other questions that people have? We will remind you as well that there is an email after this webinar. If you think of questions after the workshop, that you can submit any other further follow-up questions to that email, and we will happily answer them. All right, if there's no more questions, Beth, I think you can continue on.
Yeah, so next slide, just a recap of all the steps then for the tool. Your first step is customizing the template for your components, and doing that overview and description for each of the scenarios. You're creating the separate sheet for each one of them, and then going through the steps. Again, the step one on documenting the change, do not try and do this all at once. It's good to step back and go through it in stages, and thinking about that future state and documenting things is a really good first step, and to do with your teams. And then go back and look at the other aspects of it. The risks is step two, the benefits. Those two can easily be done together. The transition activities, probably a good idea to go back that one more time to make sure you've captured everything and how that fits in with the next steps of really putting together the plan, and taking some time to think about high level, how are your budgets going to be impacted with these various changes, so you can get ready for that financial analysis, the negotiations, and amending those budgets. So I hope you find it useful, and see that it can be a simple, where it's very simple triggers for your brain to now go forward and develop those potential options that you might be presenting to your community council, do a comparison of them, and get those necessary approvals, and develop your detailed plan, which will be next time. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much to our presenters and to all of you for joining us today. The recording for this session will be available later this week on the ARMA website. For those that want to revisit the conversation or just want to flip back to
Kayla, just before you wrap up, we do just have a couple more slides.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, if we could just actually mention a little bit about our next workshop, so that we can prepare you a little bit for what to expect from that. Our next workshop is on transition planning, developing that transition plan. And we'll pull from the EPR transition tool that we worked through today. So you'll get that sample, and you can start to identify your planning activities through the tool. Then in the transition tool, we'll use that to go through activities that will be in your transition plan, how you can assign roles and responsibilities, and identify milestones and implementation timing. So we'll go through all of those next steps on Wednesday, March 27th. It'll be from noon till 2 o'clock. And the reason, if we can just flip to the next, the reason why we have a transition plan is to just so that the community can describe expected changes that are coming up, identify impacts of the change to the people, business processes, and facilities and equipment in the community, develop communication tools, as Beth was mentioning, that's a really good way to mitigate some of the issues that may come up, appropriately assign roles and responsibilities, as I mentioned, and understand the timing requirements. So with all of that said, prior to the next workshop, if participants could please complete the transition tool for a base scenario and any other scenario that you consider relevant to your community. So you do that by creating another tab if you have another relevant scenario for your community. It's recommended that these steps be completed collaboratively with the team from your waste management business unit. Although on a preliminary basis, you can do it at a high level and work through it just to get the discussion going in your community. Okay, thanks, Kayla. I'll pass it back over.
Yeah, of course. Again, so thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks to our great presenters. This has been a great conversation, and we were really pleased to see so many questions. So yeah, you can register for this next upcoming webinar on the ARMA website, as well as access the tools that were mentioned today and the various documents. And of course, if you have any questions, the EPR team, you can contact them via email for any of those that pop up. But yeah, thanks so much for joining, and this webinar will be available on the ARMA website later this week.